Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am so happy and grateful you're here today. On this podcast, I love to talk about things that matter. It's important we're talking about life and death. And I know these are hard conversations to really lean into. They're uncomfortable. We don't want to think about our own death. We don't want to think about other people dying. And yet the inevitable will happen at some point. And sometimes we just don't want to deal with it. So we put things off. And today is the day we're not going to put things off. If you make a decision today to face the inevitable, get your paperwork in order, your estate buttoned up. So you get your power of attorney, you get your living will, you get your will, you get the power of healthcare attorney documents, everything in order for yourself and your loved ones, you will be so glad you did. Even though it's hard, even though you have to rumble through your own mortality and how to have these conversations, we're going to walk you through all that today. We're going to walk you through how to start a hard conversation with a loved one. We're going to talk about why this is important and family dynamics. Anytime we do a will, it highlights the dysfunction in the family every time. If there's dysfunction, it's going to bring that to the surface. It's going to invite us into deeper work. And sometimes we put these off because we don't really want to deal with that. We talk about that throughout this episode. And that's why I think it's so important. I grew up, my dad is an attorney and he does estate planning here in Indianapolis at Dale and Eakey. He's been doing it most of my life. And so I grew up with him talking about the importance of this paperwork. And I've talked about it with my kids, how important it is for us to have our ducks in a row and for them. And I know it's a weird conversation to have. I share more about that on this episode. And if you haven't done it, I highly encourage you to do it. I really do. And when my daughter went off to college, we also got paperwork done so we can power of attorney and healthcare in case we need to take care of her. Once you turn 18, you don't have access to any medical records. And you really need that. So I highly recommend listening to this whole episode and leaning into the discomfort that this brings. And it'll bring up many probably stories of how your family may have handled this, how somebody else's family may have handled this, what went well, what went wrong, not great. And maybe you're going to take lessons from this and do it differently. So let me introduce you to my guest today, because it was just a great conversation about this whole process. Her name is Amber Saunders, and she shared early in her career that her grandmother passed away, and her grandmother was prepared, and what a gift that was. And not long after that, her uncle passed away, and he was not prepared. And after seeing the dramatic difference estate planning can make, she felt called to spare other families the pain and needless expenses and confusion that they went through. She founded the Saunders Firm to guide families like yours through the estate planning process so that you can be proud of the legacy you'll leave behind one day. So we talk about all this, and we're linking everything in the show notes in terms of if she does talk about her favorite books. I'm now linking everything in the show notes. I'm also linking that in the newsletter. So if you don't have access to a pen and paper, you can click on the link and order it right there. And that not only helps the podcast, it helps you have those resources to pass along. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Amber. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. I am so excited about my guest today. We talk a lot about grief, and we haven't talked a lot about planning. How do we plan for the inevitable? I hate saying this because it's something we don't really like to talk about, but at some point we're all going to die. And we have to start thinking about planning for those things. And I want to really hold tender space for this subject. If this brings up any feelings, just take a deep breath and know that you're not alone. And grief is a subject that brings up many emotions. And just take a deep breath, feet on the floor, hold that compassionate space. So, Amber, thank you for joining us today on the Close the Chapter podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, tell us about you and your journey with kind of estate planning and what you're doing and how you got here.
I was always going to be a lawyer. My mother said I told her in like kindergarten. So I don't know. It's probably because her favorite show was Perry Mason. And so I watched all of the shows all the time when I was a kid. And so I thought I was going to do like criminal law, but I'm too much of a softie and my client went to jail and I started crying. And so I was like, I probably shouldn't do that anymore. That's not going to be for me. I don't want to get hardened by any of this. My grandmother had had a stroke, I think, when I was right after I'd graduated college. And I didn't know until at that time that sometimes if you have a stroke, it can have you to start having symptoms of memory loss and things like that, dementia. So she started slowly, like forgetting things. And then she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's at some point when I was in law school. And it was pretty easy for my mother and my uncle to take care of her because my grandmother's the only one who I knew who did any estate planning. She had healthcare directive, power of attorney. She deeded the property to them and then gave her and my grandfather a life estate so they couldn't get kicked out. Like she did all of this stuff like before I was born. And so the house that she was in was my great grandmother's house that was passed down to her, then went to my mother and my uncle. And over that time period, I saw grandfather, all these people pass away. And it was just a hot mess. But when my grandmother passed away, it was easy because she had already taken care of it. And the last one who passed on that side was my uncle. And my mother was in court 3.5 years, flying back and forth to Boston, Massachusetts from Atlanta to handle his affairs. And he, I think, just didn't think it was a big deal because the only thing he really owned was the house that he had with my mother. And it still was just so much of a headache for her after having lost all that family. And so because I really couldn't help them, but I saw this house that she finally was able to sell, funded her retirement. And my mother was diagnosed with cancer this year. And literally, she's gone through chemo, her radiation, her last day is this Wednesday. And the only reason she's not working is because of my great grandmother's house that was passed down, that was sold, that did not have a mortgage on it because she paid for school for me. She did all those things and she didn't necessarily save for herself. So her grandmother's house has been able to take care of her while she's sick. And so just my life from a practical perspective, I see why it just benefits people to think about those things because it can help your kids, whoever you're leaving things to in moments where they need it. And you don't even think it's going to be that significant, but it can mean a lot to them.
Could be life changing. I mean, look at your mom, because that going through chemo is so emotional and taps and zaps your energy. And there's so much in that. And that now she can focus on her recovery because the house was left to her. I mean, it really is a gift that keeps on giving. And you never know the need and how much someone will need that and what a deep impact it has on their life.
Absolutely.
And so someone says, well, I don't even know where to start. Am I too young? Where does someone even begin to kind of rumble through? How do I get started? In what age? And so can you share more about that?
At any age, you can really start because once you become 18, you're an adult, even though you might not be all the way. But for parents, when their children are going off to school, you can't find out about tuition and all sorts of things unless your children sign a power of attorney or something giving you authority to do so. Not that your 18-year-old or 19-year-old wants to think about a healthcare directive, but there are some decisions that you might need to make for them. But now they're adults that you need to have something on paper that says that you can still handle this for them. So that's a part of estate planning. Just what do I want done with my body if I can't speak for myself? Who can pay my bills and handle things when I can't? Who do I want to give that authority to? So it can be as young as 18, you're graduating high school and about to go to college, sign something saying that your parents can still help you with those things. Then as you get older, if you get married, the example of it that I think of is Terry Schiavo. Like she was 20 something, I think, when she had maybe 26. She had a medical incident, was in a vegetative state. Her husband wanted to remove her from life support. Her parents didn't agree, and her parents sued. And they fought for 8 years. It's 8 years of medical bills, 8 years of all of these things that probably the husband would be responsible for because nothing was written down to say what she wanted, if she wanted the plug to be pulled, if any of those things happened. Now, ultimately, he was allowed to make the decision, but nobody thinks to do that at 25, 26 years old. But her family, even though he was the person to make the decision, because she didn't say what she wanted in a living will, or they could contest what his decision was. So those things should be cleared. Don't automatically think that just because you're married, that your spouse, somebody else in the family might not agree with it and might want to stop that. As much as you can put down on paper, the better. And then guardianship, like if you're having children, you name godparents, but you want to have something on paper that is your choice for who can take care of your children if you came home late, if something happened. I know back in the day, my mother just let me go to my neighbors. But technically, that's not, you're not supposed to have that. You need to have something that says that this person can actually have custody so that your child doesn't have to go through DFACS or foster care temporarily until a relative comes. So I think for some people, if their families are just starting out, they might not be as concerned with how assets might pass if they have things that have beneficiary designations. Those don't have to go through court or anything like that. So you can put those people on a bank account, name them as payable on death. But for minor children, and you definitely need guardianship documents, and for just everyone needs a healthcare directive and power of attorney. And then as you accumulate assets, depending on what they are, then you can revisit whether or not you need a will, at what point, if you own a home or a trust or something like that. But the basic living will, healthcare directive, power of attorney, everybody needs as soon as they leave their parents' house.
So that's key. And helping your kids or grandkids with this can be benefit, what they need, educating them on how does this work? Why is this important? Would you say that's helpful for parents and grandparents or mentors
Absolutely.
or family members to facilitate?
Yes. And I think it's hard. I mean, it's hard. No one wants to talk about if something happens to me, but the younger you talk to them about it when they're younger, then I think it might be easier for them. One, if you're incapacitated, to make decisions or help you because you all had conversations about what you would want to happen in the face of an emergency. It won't be such a shock. And I've seen too many people to count who had to make decisions, but they didn't really know what their parents wanted and they felt guilty.
Yeah.
I don't know if my mom wanted to be cremated. I know I did, but she didn't tell me and I didn't know. And so it was years later that I spoke to this woman and she just felt bad. She didn't know if she did the right thing because no one ever had the conversation with her. So just taking that stress off of them so that they don't have to think about, well, is it what they really wanted? Those conversations should be had as early as possible because you just never know.
How do you bring it up with your parents? Let's say you have aging parents, like they do not bring it up. They don't really want to go there. They're just hesitant. And then you feel uncomfortable. You feel afraid to bring it up because they think you're all about the money or whatever, because people have stories that we make up. How do you recommend someone bringing this up?
So first, I probably tell them just breathe. Like you just got to get quiet and get with yourself. And because depending, if you're nervous about it, then that's going to translate. I feel like that energy transfer, they're going to be able to tell whatever's going on. So as much as you can steady yourself, do that. Then just be clear of the outcome. Do you want them to tell you where these assets are supposed to go so that you're not fighting with your siblings? Do you think that, like, what is the outcome of the conversation? For me, like, I'm an only child. I know that if my mother is sick, I'm going to be under my desk. So she better tell me everything now because I'm not going to be able to make a decision. So I just want to know so that I don't lose my mind. So that's the outcome of the conversation for me. Mom, you have to make this easier for me because I don't think I'm going to be able to handle it. So this is not about rushing you. This is about, I don't have anyone else to help me with this. So you got to help me with this while you're here and while you're able to help me with this. And I found that if you make it more so about that rather than it being about money or assets or distributions, there isn't a parent on earth who wants to see their child suffer, I think, for the most part. There are extremes of all of those things. No one wants to see you upset. As soon as I say that to my mother, she's like, okay, well, let's sit down and do it. Because she knows her child. Your parents know you. When there are situations where there are multiple children, there's generally one who handles all the business, who can get things done. There's one who might be under the table like me. There's different personalities within a family when you have multiple children. So the parents already know who's going to be the one to handle most of the things. And so if they just talk about, can you just make it easier on me? I don't know many people who will say no. But if it's, mom, you need to do this and you need to do this, I think children should think about how it feels to have someone try to, whether it be take your freedom away. If you're trying to get them to sign a power of attorney, if they've taken care of themselves their whole life and now all of a sudden you want to, that is threat. It doesn't feel good. But if it's framed in a different way, they don't feel like they need you to take care of them. They're the parent, you're the child. They're supposed to be taking care of you. So you have to think about how it can be, one, beneficial for them and can take care of everyone. So that's why I think the outcome of it, I don't want to do the wrong thing. I don't want to feel like I didn't honor your wishes. I just need to know what you want because we don't talk about it. So I don't know, and I don't want to do it wrong. You're kind of taking care of both of those things at the same time and taking the threat away from the idea of getting a power of attorney or finding out how to distribute things. It's not really about that. It's, I don't want to screw it up. So I think it just depends on how you position it and what you want out of the conversation. If you come at it from that place, I think it's a little less threatening for them.
That makes sense. And you're acknowledging how hard it is for them too. Like, this is not an easy conversation for them to rumble through, facing life or death. They're facing their own mortality. And this brings up having to look at your own death. And I think that is something we don't talk about. We don't talk about all those emotions that are connected to that grief, that fear, that sadness, kind of that wanting to push away from it and that it will never happen. Right.
Right.
I think there's something to be said about that. Like, we're going into delicate territory.
Absolutely. Even though it's not like we don't know it's going to happen, but I don't know if we avoid it, then, it'll take a while to get here. Or if we talk about it now, then it means tomorrow I'm going to go outside and get hit by. We're superstitious in so many ways about it. We don't want to even say it because we feel like, oh goodness, it's going to hurry up and happen. And that doesn't really happen that way, but we have that fear. As opposed to looking at it as like, if you think about the fact that tomorrow is not promised, then every day that you're here and every moment that you have with your loved ones, and it should be even more precious because you never know when your time will expire. So why care about the little argument you have with your husband? Because who knows how much longer you have with them or with your mom, or none of those things should matter if you know, because at the end of the day, the clients that I have who've gone in hospice, they don't care about any of that at the end of the time that they have. They really don't. So maybe it'll make us think about that.
Exactly. I think that one of the greatest gifts my mom gave me, she died 2 years ago, was she went and she had picked out her gravesite. She had picked out her location. She had prepaid for it. I mean, these are like little gifts that you don't have to worry about as on the other side. Like, these decisions are already made. There's relief, like you said, you'll be under the table. Yeah, because your brain, you're in grief. You can't process it. Your body literally will shut you down. Like, it's too much. And then some people try to just push through it, right? So these things, making these decisions and talking to them now are gifts. And so what I find is infighting sometimes with clients, like we have siblings and someone gets picked for, let's say, healthcare power of attorney, and someone gets picked for the financial power of attorney. And so then they fight over, I wanted to be that, or why didn't you pick me to do that? Can you speak a little bit into that?
One, the hope understand why, but two, you know yourself and you know your siblings, and parents just know us very well. I mean, I don't know a parent who doesn't know which child can handle what. And that is probably why my mother didn't argue with me. Like, her friend she knows that I'm not doing it. So, I mean, if my mother sneezes or is sick, like, I'm very close to both of my parents. And so they know. So I just ask. So I think that if siblings have the conversation with their parents, whether they want to, you can want to. This is about being able to follow these instructions when it feels like the ceiling is falling in. And so I think the easiest thing to do during those time periods is to be able to follow instructions rather than have to make a decision. You can just, I know I need to go take mom here. I know I need to do this. You can do that. If you have to decide, you might not be able to. So I think if parents have the opportunity to be able to explain that, then hopefully the hope is that the siblings will listen. But if it's just on paper and they don't understand why, then I think sometimes it can cause problems. They might follow it, but there might be some resentment. There might be some of those things for them not being the person who has chosen to do it.
Why do you think parents don't communicate? Because there's some that do their will, but they never mention it, that they've done the will. They never mention they have power of attorney or give you a copy of it, or they never mention any of it. Why do you think that is, that they don't talk about it?
This weekend, I went to a friend's mother's house to work on her documents, and she didn't want them to know because she thought that they would think something was wrong. She was worried that they would be afraid or that they would be upset. Well, why are you doing that? Is something going on? Are you sick? Are you this? And so she just didn't want them to go through a whole mental exercise just because she was trying to be prepared. She didn't want them to have to worry. She was going back and forth over the same thing you were just talking about. Who should be in charge? Who's the POA? Who's the healthcare one? Oh, this one is in medicine. So this one needs to be that one who makes the decisions, etc. But she just didn't want them to worry. And then sometimes I think they don't want to have to talk about why they made the decision, who's going to be in charge. They don't want to have to explain that or have to deal with whatever backlash might come from that. So they'll just say, oh, well, I won't be here to deal with it anyway. It's on the document. You can figure it out when I'm gone. But I think that they can't. I mean, you can do that, but the way that I've seen people fight after someone passes away, you have to do it beforehand because it can rip families up really easily.
And I think it's important that we get the courage as the adult parent or as the adult. And I even have a friend that just went last night, we met to go over her will. She doesn't have any kids and she went over everything and she got everything organized. I mean, I was so impressed. And communicating with the people on the other end is actually acknowledging the back end process for them and taking you, and you're going to have to do your own processing around it. But your fear of discord or conflict or that actually creates what you don't want. And that's the legacy you're going to leave, is that they're going to be upset with you because you didn't communicate, you didn't tell the person. That can create feelings for the person executing, managing things, that they can have feelings towards you that you didn't take care of it. And that's okay too. I mean, so I think thinking through the impact of the people on the, even if you're gone, you got to kind of own your decisions. And I think there's something to be said about confidence in owning your decisions. And it can cause people to have their own feelings about it. They can be upset. And why not talk it through now? Now, you're going to have many people say, well, I'm not talking to one of my kids, or I'm not talking to so-and-so, or how do you recommend handling those situations? Let's say there's an estrangement in the family system. So they've cut them out of the will. Would you recommend talking to that person, or just since they're estranged, let it go?
I've never been asked that. That's a great question. I think I am a person who loves family. So I always want you to talk to you. Like, that's always going to be the thing I say. Just talk to them. Why do you not want them in there? If you can repair it before you leave this earth, try and do it. But sometimes people don't want to do that. I don't think you have to necessarily announce to anyone that you kept them out. But if it's like a close relative, someone who would technically be an heir, then I think you might have, because they could try and contest it because they're not included. So every state has intestacy rules, so that if you didn't do a will or do something, they say the order of how your assets would be passed by default. If that person was potentially one of those heirs who would get something and then you would cut them out, then they might make it a little harder or make it take a little longer for the people who you did intend to get something to get it, because they can contest it and make it take longer. So it might be a good idea, if it's under those kind of circumstances, to talk to them about it. Hey, this is why. But I think you could. Maybe that will give you space to try and repair the relationship in some way, if it can be. But I found that we make up in our heads sometimes how difficult a conversation is going to be. And it's often way easier in person than what we made up in. I've done that to myself. I've hyped something up. This is going to be so hard. And then I did it and I was like, oh, this wasn't that bad. It turned out better than I wanted. So sometimes it's just us making it more difficult. If we just have the conversation, then it can repair a lot, take some stress off of us and off of them. So I lean on the side of having the conversation.
Yeah. And I think parents, if you're healthy enough to take charge of it, I think this is what you're modeling for your kids to say, these aren't easy and nothing's wrong right now. And I want to make this easier for you. And then oftentimes I find that the kids are having to bring it up, like the adult children, if you will, are having to bring it up because their parents aren't. So, and then the parents go, why are you bringing this up? And they get real dysregulated. And it's like, well, no one's trying to get something or want something bad to happen to you. We love you. We're just trying to make sure your wishes are honored.
Right.
Best way possible. And I think this brings up, I mean, I've had so many people come into therapy because it going so poorly, because they were cut out of a will, because their sibling rivalry, because a parent, quote unquote, favored one child over another. I mean, it really is the unhealth of the family system coming to the surface. Do you see that in your practice?
It's awful. That's why I have stopped doing probate, because I don't like seeing them argue about things. I think that estate planning can be a way to open up and have these conversations about whatever is there that you haven't had the chance to talk about. Because talking about whether or not you want someone to pull the plug is touchy. And again, I don't necessarily understand the sibling part because I don't have any, but I don't let siblings in the room when I'm talking to parents in the beginning, because I want them to have a conversation freely without being concerned about what their children are going to feel. And they won't do that when someone's staring in their face. And so I say, we can have a family meeting and everyone can come afterwards. But for the first time, I just want you to talk to me and just tell me what you're thinking and what everything would look like in a perfect world. But there's so many, when you have siblings, there's competing interests and feelings and things and all of those things that often there's a lot of pressure. I think that might also be a reason why they don't want to talk about it, because there's pressure on parents to try to make everyone happy. You can't do that in life. So I doubt that you can do it in a family structure when there's multiple children and people who want things from you. But this is really about your legacy and what you want to happen and how you want to be remembered. And so it's your story to tell. It's your values to pass on. It's your example to set. It's your all of those things. And so I think that's the last, it's the last love letter you get to write. So you have to get the courage to be able to have that conversation, and it will steer it the right way. You just have to trust the process. It will absolutely make it easier if you get that hard part out while you're still here.
Yes, I agree. And if you have a life transition, let's say you did your will when you were in your 20s and things have changed. Maybe you've gone through a divorce, maybe there's been job transition, kids, things have happened, deaths, and you need to redo it. When do you recommend people updating or redoing their wills?
I say I would check on things every 3 years. So hopefully, sometimes when people write a will, they'll list every asset they have. I don't necessarily do that unless they have specific gifts, because I don't want you to have to change it all the time. Every time you sell something, or then you have to go back and amend it and do a codicil or do whatever it is. So depending on how it's written, you might have a little space, but I'd normally just check in with whoever you wrote it with every few years, between 3 and 5. Just, okay, the children are a little older. Now I know their personalities. Now I know I don't want to give this one anything outright because they might buy a Lamborghini as soon as they turn 18. I'm going to change this and do these things differently because things change and life starts lifing. Because life changes so fast, you probably need to check on it. I see people who will do one when their children are really young and then now they're 20 something, or they might have grandchildren. It's like, okay, we definitely have to redo that now because none of these things apply anymore. So it should be something that lives and breathes and changes as your life changes so that it's always up to date as much as possible anyway.
Let's say someone suddenly has a stroke or starts getting dementia or has a brain, something's happened neurobiologically, something's happened and health has changed and the person no longer is capable of maybe even making the decision to do a will. What does someone do in those situations?
They're going to have to get guardianship or conservatorship over them because if they don't have the capacity to sign anything, then it won't be valid. In some circumstances, like depending on what you're setting up and trying to do for them, through having guardianship through a court or conservatorship, set up a trust or set up things for them, and then have them go to the heirs, however, is the default. You probably wouldn't be able to do anything outside of the default because it's going to go through the probate court at that point. The court's going to decide if that's how it needs to go or what's in the best interest of that person. But you'd have to go get the court to intervene at that point since they can't make any decisions for themselves.
Yeah. And I know that can be a challenge because you have to prove through testing or medical records. I mean, there's a whole process to get guardianship. Is that right?
In most states, there's going to be either the court will appoint a physician or someone to examine them, or you can provide their medical records. When I've done it before, I just let the court appointed person meet with them. They'll get, like in Georgia where I am, they get their own lawyer and then they'll have a physician do an interview and then they make the recommendations either way to the court and then the court will decide. So if you have the medical records, you might be able to do it in advance if there's a history of them having some issues, but the courts might appoint someone anyway just to make it easier.
And I know this can be hard for folks this is a whole nother level of work that you have to take on when we're caretaking a loved one through things and they don't have things set up. It's a whole nother level of hard, I think, for people when it's not set up ahead of time.
Absolutely.
I just think it puts so much pressure on the one, they're trying to caretake, and two, on top of the caretaking, you're trying to legally get some of these other pieces and parts done so you can have access to pay for healthcare for them, to get them services and resources they need. Here's the other component. You mentioned it at the beginning, feeling guilty. People feel guilty for making decisions, right? And it's so hard. Let's say a parent says, I don't want to go to a facility, but they don't have the resources to do in-home healthcare and you can't physically do it. I mean, it's impossible. There's guilt on all these decisions. How do you help people work through the guilt?
I try to recommend therapists and caregiver groups. Like, there's nothing that can prepare you for having to take care of your parents because these are the people who you looked up to first. These are the people who could do anything, who can solve your problems growing up, whatever these things are. And so to see them in a weakened state already is going to trip you out. It's going to do something to you psychologically. If they're sick and they're not there anymore in the way that you knew them from a whatever mental capacity, that's going to do something to you. I had a client whose father is essentially in home hospice and he's a little paranoid now. He thinks she's doing things and she was close to her father her whole life. And so she's like, why would he think that? And I have to tell, that's not your dad right now. Your dad's still there, but he's not the same person. You can't look at it that way because you're not going to be able to get this done. If you start thinking about why would he think that I would do that? There's so many things that are going through your head as a caregiver that you have to get some help from somewhere else. Any place that you can, whether it's be a caregivers group where you can talk to other people who are going through the same thing, because that's just and I wrote an article about it the other day, but I didn't know what it was called when I was going through it with my mother, but like anticipatory grief. The person is still there, but you are grieving that they are not the parent or the person or whatever it is. With death, there's finality, but it's almost like the person is dying in front of you. And what are you supposed to do with that? Except go meet with the therapist every week and go talk to a caregiver group and try and get as much support as possible because you never know how it's going to show up. And I don't really know how to tell anyone how to manage it, except what I was told, which is try and take care of yourself as much as possible. Whatever that means, whether it's go to the spa or do something, because I was just driving to work and I would randomly cry.
Yes.
Or be talking to a client and have to go to the restroom because something reminded me of whatever was going on with my mother. I just let it come because it's going to come when it wants to. I don't have any control over it. I'll go to the bathroom, let it come out, gather myself, come back to what I'm doing and not beat myself up because I don't know what to do. But you have to try and find something because you never know how it's going to show up for you whenever it does. And it's really hard.
And it will. That's the thing.
It's going to come.
Grief will not let you out of it. Those are grief bursts when you're like, I was fine 2 seconds ago. And somebody,
like, where did this come from?
What's happening? Like, I don't even know. I was okay. And now I'm like, I'm on the floor in a puddle or I'm frozen and I can't do anything. Like, I don't even want to go to work. I'm barely getting it. Like, these are physiological signs of grief. And like you're saying, anticipatory grief, like you're walking your mom through life or death. I mean, that's really, and you're not prepared for that. No one prepares us for this. Slowly watch somebody kind of what feels like die and parts of them die off. It's painful. It's hard. It's a grief journey. Don't think we talk about that much in terms of when you are the caregiver, when you see a loved one get sick, the impact it has. Mentally, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, it impacts us. And there's no getting out of it, whether you had a good relationship or not a good relationship. Because not everyone has a great relationship with their parent and they're taking care of them, which is also hard.
Right.
So,
I mean, adulting, man, it's not, it's like we've been on earth for how long and we still don't have a rule book on what we're supposed to be doing here. Still don't know.
No. And then we're supposed to have all this paperwork in and we're supposed to get all these documents completed. Regardless if you're single or married or have kids or no kids, everybody needs these documents for yourself. It's called self-care. Like, yes, it's for your loved ones. It's also for you to honor what you want and what you need and what you don't want. Like, do you want to be an organ donor? We ask that on our license, but we don't put it in anything. Like, there's so many nuances. And I just think if we normalize this conversation, families would be more apt to have them. I mean, we're on vacation and my daughter, who's at 17, she's turned 17. She's like, do you want to be cremated or buried? Like, this is our conversation. I was like, good.
That's cool.
Yeah. We're having good for us that like, okay, we're having an open environment that you can talk about this. And she wanted to know, what do you want at your funeral? What kinds of songs do you want played? I mean, these are like triggered by who knows what conversations, but this is so important that we are allowing someone to bring it up and we're tolerating it. We're like welcoming it.
That's beautiful that she asked.
Yeah.
That's kind of
at 17 in high school. I'm like, this is what we're talking about, but this is what I encourage people to do. Like, this is it. All of it. Welcome it. Even the hard, even if you don't know the answers, sit with them, whatever it works for you, whatever that means for you, meditate, write about it, journal so you can get clarity. Don't you feel like that's important? You need clarity on what you want. Otherwise, you're going to avoid doing this.
Completely.
Because you're like, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. And push it off. I mean, there are people who sit in front of me when I ask that question, they don't know how to answer it because they've never really thought about it, whether they wanted to be buried or cremated, whether they want to do any of those things. And so it's kind of jarring for them. So before you come in, you have to sit with it yourself because it's going to happen. The step, breathe it, and thinking about talking about it with someone else. But maybe the first step is doing it for yourself. So then you know what that process is and what it feels like. And then you can empathize and talk to someone a little bit better when you're trying to get it done for your parents. But if you didn't even do it for you, it's kind of, you don't know what they're going through or thinking about or any of those things.
I love that. I think that's and that's what I say in therapy. We got to do it for ourselves first. It's the same rule, right?
Yeah.
And then you'll have an understanding of maybe, and you don't want to project your experience on someone, but you have a deeper understanding of what it's like. So I love that.
Or how hard it is. Yeah.
Exactly. Or how hard it is and what emotionally comes up. This is a little deviation, but what's been the most transformational book you've read in your life? I know this is a big question, but I love books. And so I'm curious, have you had a book that has spoken to you?
Yes. I would say there's two books. So I read The Alchemist every year. I love it. I love how it tells a story and there are all these lessons in it when you're just reading something that's supposed to sound like fiction. And I read it every year. And then it's probably all three of them really I read, but I'm obsessed with, or I read every book from Ryan Holiday. So I love The Obstacle is the Way, Ego is the Enemy. Those are the two. And I think there's another one that's a trio that's in that he sells all three of them together. But The Obstacle is the Way really is just about the thing that you're trying to avoid, that you don't want to do. That hard thing is probably the way to whatever freedom or whatever goal or what you're trying to get to. And then The Ego is the Enemy is really just ego is the enemy, that don't get caught up in all those things. Just do the right thing, what you're supposed to do, all those things, and the rest of it will take care of itself. Don't get caught up in ego and all the things that we often get caught up in on social media or any of those things. And those are the books that I always like reread, those three.
I love those. I love those. Is there anything we did not cover that you felt like was important when we're talking about planning?
Yes. So I would say I want people to, if nothing else, take away from this conversation that planning is really not even about your assets. People think about estate planning or doing all these things to make sure, okay, my bank accounts, it goes to this person, it goes to this person. But you're a whole human being. And when you're not here, people are going to miss you. So what do you want their last memory to be? Or what do you want their memories to be, period? I have a notebook that my grandmother gave to me that she wrote little notes for me on each page. This is her necklace that I wear every day. Our birthdays are 4 days apart. She gives it to me. This is my uncle's wedding ring that I wear on my finger every day. So I carry them with me all the time. I don't care if they left me anything. I miss them. I want to talk to my grandmother. I want to see my uncle. And so if people, whatever keepsakes, those are the things that are going to matter to the people that you love more so than this $50,000, $100,000 insurance policy. Yes, that can help, but you won't be there. So we have clients who we do legacy interviews with, that there are things that I didn't know about my grandfather until I was at his funeral and his brother came to speak. Record yourself, write things down about yourself. There's a wonderful woman who helps people write their own eulogies. There are things that parents don't tell their children about their lives. You were a whole person before you became someone's mom or dad. Talk to them about who you are, how you are. Let them get to know you, whether it be record a video so they have something to listen to or something like that, because they're going to miss you. It's not just your stuff. So figure out a way to tell your story in some way so that when you're not here, they can remember you or have a piece of you with them. It's not just your stuff.
I love that. I think that's so true. And I recommend people take photos, record their parents or your loved one, whoever it is, if you can. So you have a video. And I know those are so comforting to people when they're in grief, to be able to pull up the video, whether you've made the video or you've recorded a video. It's so soothing to hear their voice, because the one thing people want to do is they want to ask them. They want to hear their voice. They want to ask them questions, and they feel like they can't. So I think I love that recommendation. If people want to find you, where can they find you?
Oh, our website is www.thesaundersfirm.com. And then I am on Instagram at Ask Amber Saunders, and anywhere else you probably can just put in Amber Saunders and it will pull me up. Oh yeah, that's right.
Thank you so much, Amber. We covered a lot of ground in a little bit of time. And I just hope this is helpful to anybody that is really toying with doing a will. Maybe you've done a will, and maybe encouraging you to have the conversation. The other thing I wanted to mention that just came to me is what you tell your kids to do after you die. They hold on to that. And if they can't do it, they feel guilty. So if you say, now you're in charge of the family, which is really something I recommend people don't say, or now you take care of your siblings, or it puts so much pressure on the survivor. So just notice what you're saying and the weight that can carry.
I didn't think about that. Yeah, you're right.
I think it can create so much angst if the person feels like they can't take care of their sibling, or they can't do whatever they wish this responsibility was. So just be mindful of that, what you share. with your loved ones too, because they take that to heart and they want to honor you most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So
you're right.
Thank you, Amber.
Thank you so
I'm so
much.
grateful for you and the work you're doing in the world.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, KRISTEN, Boyce, BOICE.com. Thanks and have a great day.